Hello, I'm Manueltos, and today I'd like to talk a little bit about the political spectrum. Now, let me just emphasize that what I'm looking at is a political spectrum based on populism as the left versus hierarchy as the right. And when I say populism and hierarchy, I mean the theories on sovereignty. So, populism as a theory of sovereignty would mean the idea that the people are sovereign in a country, whereas hierarchy as a theory of sovereignty would mean that whoever is at the top of the hierarchy is sovereign. Now, one thing I would like to emphasize before this is that while this is meant to look at the left right spectrum in regards to, for example, the French Revolution and taking that and extrapolating it to a logical extreme. I will also say that this is obviously not the only type of left right spectrum that has been done, nor am I going to say that this is the only correct way to do a left right spectrum. I think a lot of it has to depend on the cultural context. However, my perspective here is going to be based on taking this idea of popular sovereignty versus hierarchical sovereignty, and therefore placing individual examples of theoreticians or politicians on the spectrum in order to uh, elucidate what I mean exactly by this type of analysis. Okay, so let's get right into this. So, on the absolute left, that is to say, the side that purports that the people are absolutely sovereign, you have, for example, Karl Marx, who argues for a class warfare and for the proletariat to rise up. So, in Karl Marx's view, the proletariat are sovereign, and in under a communist system, the proletariat rule themselves, in essence. Now, there's obviously a lot of different outgoings of this, and I will emphasize that the idea of freedom versus, let's say, tyranny, and the idea of republicanism versus monarchy, and various other ideas are don't really map onto this as being primarily left or primarily right, because there can be people in favor of liberty who also believe that this is secured through a valid and legitimate hierarchy. There's also people that are very that favor a very republican form of government, that also have this idea of sovereignty as depending on hierarchy. So I'm making that emphasis to clear up some confusion that there might be in regards to how some of these people on the chart are represented. Now, as to the exact top-down order on the chart, that isn't actually a political axis. It simply gives me the opportunity to give multiple and diverse examples in order to really express what the actual distinctiveness is of any particular position on the political spectrum, rather than having a single example and people automatically making an assumption. Because in most political discourses, people agree that Karl Marx is left wing, okay? However, people wouldn't necessarily agree that somebody else is left wing. So when I place not only Karl Marx, but other people on the left, I'm trying to expand the diversity of the sample in order to explain what it is that makes the sample unique, and that is the idea of the popular sovereignty taken to an absolute level. Similarly, Benito Mussolini was very nationalistic, very populistic, and once again, an example of someone who is very far left, who did not abolish the monarchy, and who also believed in a strong and centralized state wherein a lot of power was held by political institutions. However, his economic theory, the economic theory of fascism, was very much in favor of a unionization of economics. And the political theory of fascism, whereas operating under a strong state, had a very populist theory going behind it, and a very populist appeal that it used to further itself. And therefore, that is why it is considered to be left wing under this definition of a left right dichotomy. Ayn Rand is a bit different from the others, whereas the others, that is Benito Mussolini and Karl Marx, take a very or a more collectivist approach to popular sovereignty. Ayn Rand takes a more individualist approach. That is to say, for example, the emancipated individual. And so a lot of left libertarians, especially objectivists, that is, people that adhere to the ideology of Ayn Rand, believe that people should primarily focus on their own interests rather than worrying about the interests of somebody else first. Now, that's not to say that they don't care about other people. That would obviously be a straw man position. But the extreme here, the extreme here is more extreme than regular liberalism, where in under regular liberalism, the liberalism of John Locke, for example, you have a situation where people have not so much an emphasis on egoism as Randian objectivism has. And therefore, Ayn Rand is much more on the absolute left side of things than John Locke. So John Locke, the archetype of liberalism, is, of course, left-wing, and this, of course, makes sense historically. In the French Revolution, a lot of the ideas of the left were ideas that had also been expressed by John Locke and other philosophers leaning into liberalism. So liberalism as a political movement, whether it is classical liberalism or later forms of liberalism, or the descended forms of it, libertarianism, socialism, different types of socialism, national socialism, and fascism, they're all left wing. So Sun Yat-sen is known in China as one of the primary founders of the Republic of China. Now, he was very well revered in both the current Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. He is by many considered to be a social democrat. He had a position with some Georgist policies, although I'm not sure whether they were implemented fully. So he also falls on the left side of things because he wanted to build a China that had an emphasis on the five main people groups of China. Friedrich Ebert also is on the left, but not on the absolute left, because although he had some certain socialist leanings in the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which still exists today, but in the days of the German Revolution, there was a situation where the government was overthrown and people started establishing workers' councils, and Friedrich Ebert managed to come into the leadership of Germany at the time. But instead of taking Germany down a full-on socialist direction, he decided to make a compromise government, a government that included the more conservative and in some cases reactionary opposition and more central positions. And of course, this led to a situation where the more radical socialists ultimately went against the government and ended up having some revolts, but it averted a larger civil war that there could have been if Friedrich Ebert had decided to go full socialist. So he is on the moderate left. He's not on the absolute left on here. Julius Caesar. The reason why Julius Caesar is in the center is because he was generally considered to be one of the later elements of the populares faction. That is, people in the Roman Republic's government that favored increased rights and benefits to the plebeians and to the broader Roman and affiliated populations in the Republic. Now, the way he went about doing this had a lot to do with land reform, and that was a long-standing process. I'm not going to talk about it because it's a big story all in itself. However, he also managed to appropriate a lot of power to himself throughout his political career and throughout the Civil War, in which he played a central role. And it is worth noting, however, that later on, when there was an opportunity to declare himself king, he was very hesitant to do so. And many people believe that he did indeed want to become a king, although it had been a taboo in the Republic. He chose not to proclaim himself, largely because there was not a lot of popular support behind the idea. So in that sense, he did very much care about what the people wanted, even if at times he was very dictatorial in a very literal sense, and tyrannical in the way he operated. Now, so Julius Caesar, however, would generally, I would say, be considered left compared to people like Cicero, his one of his major opponents. Now, Joseph II, the Holy Roman Emperor, is one of the Enlightenment absolute monarchs. That is to say, he was an absolute monarch, but he chose to use Enlightenment principles, such as the ones brought forward by the more liberal philosophers, to operate in a more populist sense. So people have described his reign as everything for the people, but nothing by the people. So he created a fusion in government with the idea of being essentially a servant to the people in the way he operated the government, while also holding power over the people, therefore essentially maintaining the hierarchy while also engaging in populism. And that's why he's also considered a centrist on this political scale. Alexander Hamilton is, I think, probably the most strong compromise position between the two sides that I can see here, because Julius Caesar and Joseph II had more of a bit of column A, a bit of column B situation. Alexander Hamilton is a more full-on, proper centrist position. In the federalism that Alexander Hamilton supported, there was an idea of the usefulness of democracy in government, but also the opposition to having it play too much of a strong role in government. So Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists in the United States were considered to be generally right-wing compared to the early Republicans, or Democratic Republicans, as some historians call them, and the anti-Federalists. Now, Alexander Hamilton himself wrote very fondly of the Electoral College, which is an alternative to a more democratic election that was chosen at the time. And he also was originally in favor of having a lifelong leader in the executive branch of the United States government, although he eventually backed off of that position. So Alexander Hamilton was very much neutral in regards to the full on liberalism that some people were pushing for and the more conservative type of government that not the Tories anymore, but the that people had seen from the established British monarchy. So he was the middle ground between those two, and that is why he is considered centrist on here. Now, on the right wing, we have Plato. Now, Plato, people might be surprised that he is on the right wing here, because a lot of people associate Plato's idea of the Platonic aristocracy as represented in the Republic as a Socratic dialogue. A lot of people associate that with a type of socialism. Now, while it might be true that it is operating in a way that is designed to have a broad benefit to society rather than any particular individual in the society or the individual wishes of those individuals in the society, it is worth noting that Plato's ideas very much were anti-democratic. He strongly opposed democracy. He was in favor of the idea of having philosopher kings. That is to say, the Platonic aristocracy was a three-class society in which there were workers, there were the protectors, the warriors, and there were also the philosophers who operated as the rulers of the society. And Plato had a very strong idea that the qualities that separated these classes were not egalitarian, they were not equally distributed among the population, but they were genetically distributed in the population. So Plato believed that the potential that people had to be philosophers or to be good workers or to be good soldiers depended very largely on the genetic makeup of the person, to the point that he believed that these could exist as separate classes that did not interact genetically. Now, that being said, he also was in favor of education in order to bring out the full potential of this, and he had an idea of collectivized raising of children rather than the individual parenthood that is seen traditionally. So for these ideas, he falls into the right wing because he believes that certain people are better suited to rule than the general population. However, he also does not go so far as to be considered an absolutist in the respect of his hierarchical sovereignty in the same way as some others on this chart are. Now, Niccolo de Machiavelli had two major works that are very famous. There's other things he wrote as well. There's, of course, The Prince, which people might view as somewhat monarchic in that it's a piece of advice to the Medici, and in the end, there's an appeal to unify Italy, which is believed to be a benefit to the Italian people. So that's a bit more left wing on that. However, he also, his theories on power are very exclusive from the ideas of popular sovereignty, even though he personally, as seen in discourses on Livy was in favor of a type of republic. So he's a Republican who is on the right wing in regards to his political theory. Now, Thomas Hobbes, people might wonder why he's on the right. A lot of people associate him with the idea of freedom of conscience and the social contract. However, it is worth noting that Thomas Hobbes's idea of a social contract is very different from the idea of a social contract that is seen by some later philosophers. Thomas Hobbes's explanation involving the social contract is primarily meant to explain how governments came to rise and why governments are necessary. That is to say, that Thomas Hobbes's idea was that humans are naturally opposed to each other. They are in a war against all, that the interests of humans and the desires of humans will naturally lead humans into conflict, and the way to resolve conflict and the way to avoid unnecessary conflict is to pull people together into a state and create what some might call the Leviathan, which is a state. And his idea on what this state would be was that this state would be led by an absolute monarch. So in that sense, his idea is he has a negative view on anthropology. However, his idea on sovereignty ends up being that the monarch is the sovereign, even though the state is composed by its constituent people. So in that sense, he is right, but not on the absolute side of things. Now, when we get to the absolute side of things, we have Han Fei with the legalist philosophy, which arose and became very prominent in the Warring States period of China. He's not the only legalist, not the first legalist, but he is very famous in that he has a book, Han Fei Zi, which is more widely read, although I would say probably not as widely read as it should be. Now, Han Fei's idea on sovereignty is similar to that of other contemporaries of his, in that he is the servant of the king or the emperor, in the sense that at the time, the primary mode of government in China was monarchies. However, his theory on government is a bit similar to Niccolo de Machiavelli, although in the legalist scholarship, it's the primary mode of government is a government through laws. That is to say that the bureaucracy needs to be strongly regulated by laws, and it needs to be established to create a well-functioning state that is able to survive its opposition. In that sense, this political philosophy is very anti-rebellion, anti-revolution, which is a quality that is seen sometimes in the left, but more frequently on the right wing of things. So his view was that the emperor, therefore, was an operator of this machine of the state. However, that a good emperor would operate as an element within the machine of the state, within the legal framework, in order to operate it well and efficiently towards realist ends, or legalist ends more specifically, if we're talking about the philosophy. So in that sense, Han Fei's ideas are right-wing. They are absolutist in the sense that the monarch is the sovereign. However, they take a bit more of a constitutionalist feel to them, even if they are not republican in their structure. John Calvin is notable in that his political ideas are very much linked to his theological ideas, because John Calvin was a theologian in that who operated in France, in the Holy Roman Empire, and in Switzerland. And John Calvin's ideas on government were very much linked to his interpretation of the Bible. So John Calvin's idea was that there was a proper hierarchy and a proper obedience that people should have. That is to say, parents should be ruling over their children. The children should be obedient to their parents. The wives submit to their husbands, and the people in the country submit to their government. Why? Because everyone is under the sovereign rule of God. And therefore, since God establishes the worldly authorities, obeying the worldly authorities is part of the obedience to God. So, John Calvin's theory of sovereignty is a theory of deific sovereignty, and that this sovereignty then transfers through to lower authorities. However, while he strongly opposed the idea of rebellion, he did have the idea, contrary to Thomas Hobbes, whereas Thomas Hobbes opposed rebellion to the point of initiation, but did not oppose it fully in the joining of rebellion. John Calvin opposed rebellion much more completely. However, he believed that obedience to the intermediate authorities in the world was contingent upon the obedience to the higher authorities. So John Calvin's idea on government also was that there should be two separate institutions of the church and the state. However, that from a realist perspective in John Calvin, since God was sovereign over both had to operate in a way that acknowledged God's sovereignty, i.e., a separation of church and state, but not state and religion. So, in that sense, that was his idea. And ultimately, he was also pro-freedom in the sense that he believed that once these obligations are fulfilled, that people can then live in a free way, although that didn't end up working out as he had imagined in his own lifetime in Geneva. Later societies saw these ideas applied in different ways as well. Now, finally, James VI of Scotland and First of England, he, some people might not know, actually wrote some philosophical literature, including literature on political theory. He is also the commonly called King James, famous for commissioning the King James Bible. But what he is most famous for in regards to his political theory is the idea of a divine right of kings, which he expressed very clearly and concisely in his literature. And he also took this to the extent of including the idea of apostolic succession in the legitimacy for his kingship, even though some other monarchs might not have done the same. Now, his ideas of kingship ended up influencing his son, King Charles I of England and Scotland, who ultimately was executed in a revolution. However, following the Civil War. However, this execution was an event that strongly influenced Thomas Hobbes's ideas, as he was very opposed to the trial and execution of King Charles. And that's why Thomas Hobbes is also on the right wing with James of Scotland and England. So, anyway, I hope that this has been informative. Once again, I will say, and if you get this wrong in the comment section, shame on you, that this is not the only left-right spectrum that exists. This is just one that I wanted to make on my views on the left-right dichotomy as based on populism versus hierarchy, and particularly applied to the French Revolution, however, expanded to include all different parts of history. So I'd like to thank you all for watching, and if you would like to leave a comment in the comment section below, tell me what you thought. Did you like it? Did you not like it? I would be happy to hear it, and I will be seeing you all next time on Awiltus over and out.